Wow. Good evening. And it's so exciting to be doing this seventh, I just recently realized, SOTA Summit Series, but the first with an actual live audience. It's so wonderful, ecstatic. Um, this series, this year's series, is focusing on democracy, education, and advocacy in the arts. It's in support of the university's common experience, which is democracy and education. So it's following a consistent theme with that conversation that's going on across the entire university. And we have with us three illustrious artists and art advocates, art-involved persons. And I, in the tradition of these sessions, will have them to introduce themselves. This is an informal table talk conversation. I like to call it a kitchen table top conversation. So if you have any questions at all out there while we're going on, feel free to just raise your hand and someone will find you with a mic and interject because it's like pass the gravy or whatever. So just, if you have something, please feel free to interject because this is primarily about you and for you. And welcome to those of you who are online. You should be here. You're missing out. So first, I'll start on this end with Alessandra Marconi, and I'll ask you to introduce yourself and an essence of what you'll do. We'll get in more detail about what you do a little bit later.
Yeah, hi everyone. Can you hear me? My name is Alessandra, and I'm originally from this area. I've been living in New York, primarily working out of New York for the past 10 years. As a dancer, choreographer, and most recently, producer of my own work. And I collaborate in all different ways. I primarily call myself a collaborator because I enjoy working with others to create the best environment for the idea that we collectively have. So my primary language is movement, and I'm also a writer. So I do a bit of everything, and curiosity leads the way for me.
Great. Thank you. And next we have Lauren Carr.
Hi, my name is Lauren Carr, pronouns are she, her, hers. I am currently the Director of Education, Engagement, and Inclusion at Ensemble Theater Cincinnati in OTR. At my core, I am an arts advocate. I am a director, I am an actor, but I am an advocate to create opportunities.
Great, thank you. And our newest addition to the School of the Arts, Sso-Rha Kang.
Hi, I'm Sso-Rha Kang. I am the new Director of Galleries and Outreach here at SOTA at NKU. I am an educator foremost, also a curator based in Cincinnati, Ohio. I would say that I specialize in banal, quite boring art, but simultaneously beautiful. I am an art historian. Well, that's my background, and I specialize in institutional critique and the white cube.
Great, thank you, thank you. So I like to start from the very basics, and our topic is democracy, education, and advocacy. So I like to look at what those words actually mean. We talk about democracy, but what does it actually mean to us individually? So could you, each of you talk about what democracy is in your mind, either what it should be, what it is in this country, or what it is in your mind or in your world? What is democracy?
I'm happy to
Oh,
start.
sure.
Sure. When I think about democracy, I think when we think about the terms that are kind of associated with it, so like freedom, liberty, equality, these are, to me, democracy feels like a utopian concept. So utopias in general being something that are almost unachievable, but we strive to try to achieve it. And these sort of values and how, as a definition, I'm not necessarily interested in democracy in that way, but I'm interested in how we implement democracy or how do we advocate for democracy? How do we see that in the arts? And I think that these are often points of contention. I think that in the arts, we're always trying to have good intentions. So how do we come to a place where we're doing the work, But we're also like simultaneously not, exploiting certain groups of people, as we all know.
It reminds me, I recently had a conversation about this because the landscape is so sort of heated at this moment for so many different reasons. And this was a person that was making a lot of decisions. And I said, I remember that I had a class in college called Multiculturalism and Democracy. And by the end of the semester, we were all like, we don't know how it works. we were like, yeah, how do you? It was like a really good, I question what we learned, but what I learned so many years after now is that it takes the initiative on behalf of a person or a group of identified like people to advocate for themselves. And it ultimately comes down to a power play. All these like many pieces of the pie ultimately equal power, which is just a frequency in my mind. I see a lot of things as just like levels of energy. One has more, one has less. A lot are just kind of like vibrating together. And so at different times, each of these things carry more power. And throughout generations, they also waver. So I agree with you in that it is less about like a definitive thing and more of an idea that we all collaborate with. And it takes the one and it takes the many to create, I guess, the idealized thing that we all try to achieve.
It's interesting to think about it being the one and the many in that I feel like so often it is hard to define because so many people feel detached from it, feeling on the outside looking in on to what are these ideals that we would like things to be. I work a lot through the social model of disability of breaking down, removing barriers, and I feel like our current model of democracy is increasing barriers left and right to make things a little bit more difficult for everyone to be involved and feel included. When ideally, those are gone and there is that level playing field. But I don't know I think one of the reasons it's hard for us to really pinpoint and describe what is our ideal democracy is so many of us feel detached from it.
I feel like within the exhibition context, we're always trying to strive to communicate democratic ideas, but it's an interesting place, especially in a gallery or museum, like as an institution. As much as we like to think of the arts as a very liberal atmosphere that is very open, it's simultaneously, high art is a place of privilege, and not everyone feels welcome in that space, and of course there are messages that are censored. So how do we kind of resolve this power play between these two things? I feel like in particular with COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, institutions were under a spotlight. And I feel like communities wanted to hold institutions accountable, asking, it's not enough to just have diverse exhibitions anymore, but also looking at staff, looking at curators, looking at board members. What does it mean to really, really implement change within these institutions that are not just optics?
Good. And let's stay with democracy. Let's stay with democracy for a bit. You just touched on some ways that your area can address I'll go with inequities and the imperfections. Let's go with the imperfections in the ideal. What are some other ways that the arts in general or your work specifically can can help us form a more perfect union, as it were?
So I believe at its core, the theater arts are held with the responsibility to hold the mirror up to society. So one of the things that I have been questioning so much for the past couple of years is what exactly are we hoping that reflection to be? I feel a lot of times theater is programmed with this ideal of this is what we want to show, but if we are truly holding that mirror up and saying, what does our society look like? If we show an ideal on the stage, are we actually reflecting? So it's this interesting place, I feel, that theater is a commentary on what's going on, but are we enforcing stereotypes? Are we breaking those down? What stance are we taking in what we present? And in many ways, as Sso-Rha said, it's not just the stories that are on stage, it's not just who wrote those stories, it's not just who is performing in those stories, it is who is directing, who is setting the lighting. I mean, who is with costumes and box office and front of house, it is every aspect of it. Our stage should reflect the audience we want, not the audience we still have. So if we're wanting to encourage that change, it has to happen through our art and then out into the public.
Who's on the board?
Absolutely.
So-
From the ground to the top,
Yeah.
all the way in between.
Good, good, good. Any other?
Well, I feel like, I mean, within visual arts or the high arts, it is a place of subversive making, and
Did
it's
you
a
say
way.
subversive making?
Yes, subversive making.
I like
I
that.
think each movement of art is inherently subversive. So even if we think about something as lovely and pretty as Impressionism, I mean, within the scope of that time period, it was very punk rock and very shocking. So I know, you're laughing. Exactly, it seems kind of ridiculous now. But this is how it goes. It's a very cyclical cycle of artists always being subversive, pushing against the grain, and then again, it becomes the new status quo. So it's like we're continuously shattering boundaries, but then it gets eaten up and it becomes normalized, which actually can be a very lovely concept as well. It means that we are growing. Art is challenging. It opens up a way of thinking, which in turn makes different ways of making. And in that way, I think that's a little more positive in terms of change, and it can be a more safe space to introduce radical ideas.
Yeah, and I, in addition to what you two are saying, I think that there's no, I think we strive for perfection a lot, even within our art form. But like democracy, like society, like all these things, we're not perfect. And so we might show something on stage and we get a lot of reflection that is upset or doesn't feel heard or something like that. And so we must try to maintain neutrality, and that doesn't mean what we're trying to say is neutral or we're trying to play it even, but when we get that reflection, I feel like it's an opportunity for us as artists to observe the reflection, because if we as programmers or makers or all these things are part of it, I feel like the singular versus the collective is all working together, then it is also our responsibility to listen to what the world around us and how they respond to the work on stage. And so there, we already get a bit of the evolution, like what you're saying. We create a new status quo with that because it creates new conversation, it creates new exposure, it creates new representation on stage. And so I think it is like sort of a ladder in that way, and sort of always pushing the bridge. But perfectionism sort of like came up as I was listening to both of you, and I think I struggle with, should I be saying this right now? Is it okay to say this? Am I breaking the boundary too harshly? Will I be categorized too much in this way right now? There's so much polarization with, I feel like if you put something out, it's either gonna go one way or it's gonna go the other way. And I think that is a huge limitation, a huge boundary that society is putting on itself right now, in sort of capping the possibility of the new, of the future, of even like what is now, because so many people don't live in those extremes, really.
One of the evolutions of the arts that I found in the past few years with more discussion-based, like with the audience, with the patrons, I think in having the ability to prime our audiences of this is what's going to be happening, and having those pre-discussions or adjacent panels that really do add to the experience, and then those post-discussions, because to your point, it is in those conversations, it is in the, well, I disagreed, well, why, and let's discuss it, that you're able to find that common ground. And that's what's so beautiful about the arts, is no one's going to look at it the same, with the same view. So I think because there has been a shift and there's so much more discussion and they're sanctioned. It's not just as everyone leaves and they're walking to the parking lot anymore. It's actual sit down, let's talk about the topics, let's have the conversations. And I think that shift is so beneficial. It helps us, it informs us on our art, absolutely, but it helps us meet those other people where they are and find those commonalities.
I think it speaks to us as artists and programmers wanting to implement change by holding, I have friends who have held post-show talk with Q&As, talk backs after the show, and I think it speaks to us wanting to be advocates in the art by saying, if you pay to come see our show, then we're going to ask you to stay a little bit longer because you've paid to be in here, and that means you care about this. Even if you just care about the folks in the show, then you would care to stay a little bit longer, and then you would listen to this, and then, that's how we're exposure, right? Yeah, that's a great point.
Well, and exposure is the exact point of that's how biases are formed, right? Excessive exposure to just one thing or no exposure to everything else, it does then create that natural bias that we all live in society, we have those inherently, but if we're able to be exposed to different things and things that make us question ourselves, it makes us more open to those changes.
Great, good. And we're all talking from fairly accomplished, mature points of view. I would typically wait till the entire end for this, but let's come to a climax with democracy, and we'll come back to it also. What do you suggest for younger artists who are just now finding their way, have not arrived to where they can be on board or where they can actually do these things, but they're studying or looking for inspiration to do their art in this democracy in a democratic way? How any suggestions for finding that path?
Do you guys have?
Yeah, you can go ahead. If
Okay.
you'd like.
I would say foremost, let your curiosity lead the way. In reflecting on how I came about into advocacy work, it was just by being exposed. It was just by listening to those around me. I went to school in New York City and got to listen to a lot of different life paths that I hadn't experienced. And from there, it's just sort of like curiosity, one thing after the next. And then I was working on projects that I cared about. So I would just quiet and then listen to what you're drawn to, listen to what you're excited by.
I would say within the context of studio arts, intentionality is very important, and also it's not a singular activity in the arts. It's a communal activity, and I think it's incredibly important as young artists to go out into their community and see what others are making and what the issues are, in their surrounding area. So I think being very aware in that sense, and to understand that their art is not just inherently for them, but it's what message are they, giving to someone else? What's the narrative that they're trying to communicate? So intentionality there, I think, is very important.
Yeah, and I feel like for myself and my journey, it truly came when I took the risk. Knowing that it's okay to fail. Failing does not make you a failure. They're two different things. In society, I think we put so much stigma around when you fail that is bad and you've done so horribly, but success breeds complacency and failure breeds growth. So try it, take the note and do better the next time. But if you don't go out and take the risk, then you're just gonna continue to sit in your basement and have all these amazing ideas for the art that you want to create. At some point, it is going out, it's putting yourself on the line. And if you fall and get back up. But knowing and trying to assess to the best of your ability what that impact will be. And if it has the negative impact, take the note. Take the note, apologize, do better. But if we never take that first step of that risk, that really scary place to be based on that fear of it not working out, it will automatically never work out. You have predicted the answer. So I think, again, I have so much of it is okay to fail. We grow so much when we do so. If you never fail, it will be the same for always.
And just one more piece on that, and it's an age-old question. Does every artist, every visual artist, every music artist, every performing artist, are we obligated to advocate? Are we obligated to contribute to democracy? Can we just make a pretty picture? Can we, not just because there's, making a pretty picture is actually contributing.
Yeah.
So it's not a matter of just that, but are we obligated to consciously, aggressively advocate, in your opinions?
So this is something that I think about quite a lot with my own curatorial practice. So I think in my introduction, may have confused a lot of you because I said that, that I specialize in boring or banal things. So for example, my first, yes, I do. So my first exhibition was about sentiment. My second exhibition was on slowness, and my third, which is coming up in October, is on nostalgia. So quite lofty concepts. And these are things that I find like just intellectually just interesting. I like the human experience. Like, what is it about that that's interesting? But then I struggle with it at times where I feel like, well, my work isn't overtly political. So am I using my platform in a just way? But then I think about other ways of advocating. So for example, I find with my curatorial practice, it's really important for me to work with young artists and champion young artists. If they're fresh out of school, I treat them the same way as someone who's a little more seasoned. And I pay them in the exact same way, which seems absurd that paying someone could be a form of advocacy, but in the arts where it's so easy to say that you just give someone an opportunity for free labor, I feel like that is a form of advocacy. And also, in terms of the way I curate, I don't simply choose objects within an artist studio, but it's very important to me that consent is involved. So from the inception to the finishing process, that it's an effort to have a very collaborative discussion, because with exhibition building, it's about creating, again, a narrative or a story, and how I choose to contextualize pieces and how they work together. I have a lot of power. So it's important to me that artists understand and they're a part of that process of knowing how their work is within that dialogue.
I mean, I personally wouldn't call those things boring.
Thank you.
I think those are quite powerful because everything boils down to the basic block. I think we can all get very eccentric and just like we can get super fancy with the things that we create, but really they all have those underlying, am I getting paid, am I treated, am I feeling safe, am I having a rich experience? So in my perspective, maybe just as a peer, I don't think those are boring. I think that those are advocacy initiatives.
Yeah, I don't know if every artist has to set out with advocacy in mind, but at the end of the day, everyone needs to be a self-advocate. So I feel like it's, and again, exactly to your point of making sure that you are getting paid, that you are having those right working environments. Now, you may not have control over all of those things, but if the artist is not advocating for themselves, there's no guarantee someone will advocate for you. So whether they need to have that lens of advocacy when you go to do your work, not necessarily. We do need the pretty pictures. We need to laugh. We need to be able to look at something and escape. That is giving society what they need. We need that levity. So it may not be in the advocacy idea of what we're talking about right now, but it is helping others. So it is in some ways creating those opportunities. But I think at the end of the day, you are still, as an artist, I think in your core, you have to be a self-advocate. Because you're putting yourself out there. You're putting yourself to the audition. You're submitting your materials. You're playing your piece. It's you.
Good. Let's move on. We'll come back to democracy, of course. Education. What is that? what should it be? Yeah.
Well, I am an educator, so I guess I have to speak on this topic. So it's an interesting dynamic in the classroom, and I think power and being a voice of authority is something that I try to make very transparent to my students. And it does scare me, because whatever I choose to lecture on, that's how I'm also influencing my students' view of the world, specifically in the arts. So their education is limited by their professors and what we can provide for them. So whatever I actively choose to incorporate in the curriculum, and also what I actively choose to exclude, that informs their perspective. And to me, it's important that they also understand that. So for example, if I'm lecturing on modern and contemporary art, I can't cover every single artist. And I let them know that, you know? And to me, that's like, I don't know, it's like a huge responsibility, because education is that little kernel that can change someone's perspective or open their point of view, or you really move through the world differently, you know, when you get an education and something inspires you. But simultaneously, it can also be something that is quite restrictive. I'm always terrified that I'm a tastemaker, you know? I mean, I love minimalism, like that Donald Judd that's outside that people don't seem to know that is art. When my students start to love it, I'm like, no, but don't, you can hate it, please. Please hate things too. You know, like I don't want them to cater their taste to what I'm giving them, for example.
Yeah, with always that hope that if they get that kernel, that then they can go down their own rabbit hole of what it is that makes them excited.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I run into the very similar things of what are we exposing our students to? Because that is a huge reflection on what we value. And exactly to what we do not expose our students to also says something, if the student chooses to put those lenses upon our work. But I always hope that there's maybe that one spark of something that then will take that student down their own path. I try to balance for myself in my daily work. I'm creating programming for younger students, for kindergarten through college years. And in some cases, students, our kids, our students who are in their 60s, 70s. And that's one part of it, and that's my institutional education aspect. But the other aspect of education that I have had the pleasure of exploring is the community education, the patron education, the audience education, which most of the time we view as engagement or outreach. But we are hoping to teach all of those people and to get those little bits of knowledge to everyone who walks into our door, whether it is that, beforehand, before they see the piece or experience the art, but we are teaching them those lessons, that we are teaching them those stories along the way. So it's all education. I mean, I don't think that any of us can walk through the day, through life with knowing everything already. So education to me is what you want to make it. If you are willing to go down that rabbit hole and really dig into all of the things that you didn't know or finding out more about what you do know, but you also will learn a lot by not learning about those things, because someday someone will be talking about it and you will have no idea. So you've chosen that path of education for yourself. So for me, it's everything that I do. I think it's easy to relegate it to the classroom, but I think it's impossible to truly walk down the street, to move through your day without learning something.
I think that's a great point. Education for me is traveling and it's exposure. You'll never stop learning unless you want to stop learning. So I love your analogy. It's not inside the classroom, it's everywhere, really, is what education is. Education is what it's not, and it is what it is. I learned a lot going to public school in the middle of cornfields, and then I learned a lot when I got the opportunity to go to college in New York City, So I made the best of my circumstances, and I learned a lot in both ways, and I continue to learn a lot. So it's curiosity for me, and every perspective matters, I think when one starts to become the dominant, then that's not reflective of actually what society is.
Yeah, and I completely agree that it's not confined to the classroom, that it's an outside experience. Because you can go to school from kindergarten through doctoral and postdoctoral and not be educated. You can, I know a few. So it is that matter of curiosity that I think was brought up earlier. So it's not just something that happens to you, it's something that you have to participate in also. But I'm stepping beyond my grounds of neutrality. Any questions out here? Just to keep me, okay, great. Let's move on then. We'll come back to both democracy and education, to advocacy in the arts. In general, we sort of touched on it before, but in general, let's look at that. Let's look at that first. What it means to you for arts in general, and then for you personally, how your work, your specific work, contributes to advocacy. I believe you already touched on it, but let's retouch.
I was recently in a training where they asked everyone, all arts professionals, to say what you do.
Say again, please.
To just simply state what you do.
Okay.
And then simply state, which was an interesting way to phrase it, why. There were some on the call that needed a few days, because to truly break down the why, it takes some self-reflection of why do we do, at our core of what we do, why do we do it? And after working through the program, for me, it came down to creating artistic opportunities. Why am I director? To create the opportunities for those stories to be told, create an opportunity for those actors to perform. Why am I a teacher? To create an opportunity for the students to learn, to create an opportunity for them to perform. Everything came down to creating that opportunity. Why am I passionate about accessibility? Because I do not understand why we can live in a world where so many of us can just walk through a door and we can easily walk through that door, not turn around, and see that there is someone using a mobility device behind us and that door slams directly in their face. So creating those opportunities, why do we not remove the barriers that we are able to do so in order for everyone to be included? So it was an interesting question. Again, they said, simply state, what do you do? Mm-hmm. Simply state why. The why it gets a little deep. And for me, truly it was, I think we are a richer society. I think our art forms are so much stronger when we have so many different perspectives, when we have those diversity of thought and background. It truly adds to the beauty and to the exposure. So much of it comes down to that, to have that broader conversation when everyone has access. So I fell into advocacy because I didn't understand why we were leaving people out, why it was everyone over here but not those people over there, but those people over there can make it a much richer conversation. So it truly was, for myself in advocacy, became happenstance of we can provide a scholarship, we can wait 5 more minutes for your audition, we can listen and understand that pace is an ableist concept. Not everyone moves at that same time. So, some things are on a clock, but not everyone works in that way. So why are we excluding those who do not function in the same way? So for me, it's opening the opportunities. It's taking down the barriers where we can in order for everyone who would like to be involved.
Why do you think traditionally that we do close that door? We, the larger.
I think specifically in the arts, there is the idea of, as you said earlier, the higher arts is elitist. We have this idea, and it is true. It is not easy to be an artist. It is not always the most financially stable career that we all go into. It's passion-based. But you have to, at some point, be able to afford it. And I think it's so easy to relegate it to those who can afford $100 tickets to attend. I think it's so easy because so much of it comes down to funding and have reporting to funders, we have to say it was, this number of people, this number of this, number of this, number of this, but we brought in all of this money. Because we do, unfortunately, at the end of the day, still have to pay for the art to happen or to be shown and presented. And I think it's so easy for it to then all of a sudden become relegated to those who can afford it. And it's so easy to leave out everyone behind them who can't, unfortunately.
Yep. It is certainly more convenient, if not right. Others, how advocacy with the arts in general or in your work specifically, either of you?
I think I touched briefly on some of the themes that I'm interested in. And I feel like, the gallery space, many galleries and museums are free, but why is it that not everyone feels comfortable in those spaces? And we know that there's a ritual, there's a reverence to it, how we behave. Sometimes we're confronted with objects that we don't understand. And I think confrontation is actually quite a good thing. I think confrontation or even rejecting something is still considering it, and often that can provoke thought and discussion. Often in deeper ways, I think anger can manifest. But I also think, although I struggle with my work sometimes not being overtly political, but I think access is very important, and themes like nostalgia or sentiment is something that's just intrinsically human, and we get that. But although that topic is accessible and we understand it, but perhaps the forms that it manifests within the gallery space by the artist, we don't necessarily always recognize, or maybe it's different than what we expected. And I think that can provoke conversation or thought, or it changes the way we look at something. So I think for me, it's with exhibition building, to me, I consider it like world building. So if I can introduce someone, give them access into this new thing that they may recognize initially. So again, something being subversive, maybe subtly subversive. And then you go home and you think about it, because often in the high arts, it's a bit more of an introspective experience than theater, where it's not like we're collectively clapping or we're laughing, but people are often in their own heads. So if they can go home and think about it, whether that's because something compelled them, or they rejected it, or they hated something, at least they're still thinking about it. And that's something that they took away from the exhibition. And I would say that's successful in that sense.
Cool. Anything?
I agree with you. I think a lot of what I do and what I do personally or what I want to collaborate on is informed by space. And so what I would create in one space is very different from what I would create in a different space. As a way to, I think as I hear you guys speaking, as a way to welcome people in and then understand exactly whatever the project is trying to communicate. So what I've created in New York is different than what I've created here in Cincinnati. And for a reason, because I'm in tune with the people around here or there or wherever. I did a project also in Arkansas, and it's very different there too, right? So space informs a lot of how I present work. And I think that ties into advocacy, because if I'm an artist and that's the language that I use, I'm trying to welcome as many people into what I do, because at the foundation of it, I believe that everybody benefits from art and also can understand and think, whether they get angry, whether they are happy or joyful or whatever it is, from the art. I think that people benefit from it. What it provokes in you is what it needs to provoke in you at any given time from any different artist. So I think it's beneficial, and I think that all of these moving parts together for me are a part of advocacy, because it is how I show up in the world, and it is how I collaborate in the world. And no matter what medium an artist chooses to use, it's how you represent yourself, and that's valid, and that should be heard. And so those are the ways that I think about advocacy for myself. But then for others, if I'm collaborating with others, it's to listen. If they have a different experience than me, it's to listen and then see how our joined, minds or tools can create an opportunity to share with the world.
And many conversations like these, people bring up the concepts from several activists generations ago of the difference between an advocate and an ally. How do you see that difference, and how does one, we obviously need both, we need everybody, but how do you see that difference, and how moving from an advocate to an ally?
For myself, I feel like with being an advocate, there's an action that is involved. How are you actively implementing ways to advocate for someone, whether that's paying them fairly, or if you're a curator or a director of a gallery and you are in your mission statement saying that you're inclusive, how are you actually presenting that, like through practice, not in theory? I feel like allyship sometimes for me can feel a bit passive, or it can be a neutral space. I saw a specific example last year with COVID and Black Lives Matter. We saw institutions everywhere have a new mission statement that they've presented on their websites, saying that they're inclusive, they're advocating, etc. However, they weren't actually implementing that in practice, and they were being called out very readily, like the Tate or the Whitney, for example. And that's like a type of allyship where I feel like it's it's a simple, meaningless gesture, which I think can be quite impactful in many negative ways. So I feel like for me, I kind of distinguish the two in that way of an advocate could be an ally, but an ally doesn't necessarily always mean that you're an advocate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I had the same response when Daryl asked the question. It's action. Like that, and that's where I think for me it really clicked in as more of an advocate when I found myself in a position that I could make those changes for others. That not just the things that impact myself and not just standing with my beliefs, but more so I'm in a position to, okay, well then let's remove that, or let's put that into place. It's taking that action. And it doesn't have to be big, massive things. It can be little things, as in, pushing and asking the questions. But an allyship does feel a little bit more passive than the advocate who is trying to make something happen.
Yes, and if you're in a conversation with people, you can be an ally and vocalize your allyship if something is lacking in that conversation. So I think there can be action, like you're saying. It's not necessarily, well, it can be a little measured, it can be big measured, but I think allyship also requires authenticity. It requires like a showing up, even if it is not even, but take it to a smaller context where you're just in a conversation. I think allyship can be small and actionable.
That's how I've typically heard people differentiate it, is the actual doing something. But again, that's the complication of conversations in general, but certain conversations like this, that each person and each time period, there'll be an evolution or a change of what an attitude is, what a definition is, et cetera, et cetera. Let's go back to some nuts and bolts. Let's go back to democracy a bit, and to the basics of democracy in this country. How can we use the practical tools of it, which I guess the core piece is voting. I guess that's the core, a core tool of this democracy in this country. What, as artists, I guess this is a simple question or an obvious question, but I'll ask it anyway. What are our obligations toward the nuts and bolts of making democracy run? the words are, they're hard to come out of my mouth because I'm not that person. Because I'm one of those, Ella, I'm more of here, but I have a responsibility to my public, to the voice.
You need to anchor it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So what are your insights on how we as artists, both mature artists and up and coming young student artists, to get involved in the nuts and bolts of this democracy, to help make it the ideal, because it's not just going to do it. There's some things we have to do to make it do.
Well, Daryl, I think that this and this have a connection. And I think that's a lot where I like to lay, which is here and here, and then how can I make the connection between two seemingly different ideas or two different types of people or whatever it is. I think that we all have the capacity to understand each other, and we can help each other. This is more of a feeler, and this is more of a doer, maybe an actionable thing. But I guess both, whether you're just standing and feeling the space, let's say an empath or something, and someone over here who is more no, I'm gonna do this, I'm not gonna feel all the things, there's still energy in between those things, and they're still communicating, So the thing would be for both, applicable to both types of people, whether you're the person that's gonna canvas on the street, or you're the one that's gonna absorb, go home, think about it, and then write an essay or something. It's to show up. It's to listen, it's to recognize, it's to observe, and it's to show up and assert your voice when you can, You write the letter to the person that is in the front of the room and express your idea about the thing, whether that's your professor, whether that's your dean, whether that's the local mayor or your governor or whoever it is. They see those things. They have an assistant who prints out the things and they see them. So I would say, in whatever way that is most authentic to you, show up. You can't do everything. We're not all made the same way. We're not all made to make public speeches and do all these things. Show up how you can, and that's enough.
And ask the questions. I think it's so easy to continue to just move through, and I feel it's hard to continue to move through without some questions percolating. I think it's easier to stuff those down and not pose them. I think it's sometimes harder to say, but why? Right? So you bringing up voting, I think it is very easy to fall into, this is where my parents sat, so that is where I will continue. I think it's a lot harder to say, well, why? What is it about that? I think it's, when it comes especially to voting, I think it's the number one thing so many people do not do, is ask the questions. I think we go along with the person that we like without seeing all of their flaws and all of the things that we don't know. The plan or the idea or the statute that may be really beneficial on the surface, but if we dig into it, this gets pretty shady. So I think, just starting out, ask the questions, show up, but don't just move through the motions. Pause, think about how it really, impacts you, and know that not all questions are grandiose and amazing, but they are still very valid, and it can seriously be as simple as, why do we need that? I think it's too easy to not ask those questions.
Agreed with all. I will add, implicate yourself, do the work. I think sometimes it's easy to separate ourselves and think that maybe we're not, capable of partaking in things that are unjust, but especially if we grew up in this country, we need to sort of implicate ourselves in the way of rewiring the way we think and move through the world, and how systems are coded. We need to learn how to unlearn things actively. And I'll say, if you're an artist, whether that's, theater or the visual arts, art is inherently political. So again, going back to that idea of intentionality, but also what you are communicating in theory to also do it in practice, whether that's through small gestures or through grand gestures. But I think activism can take place in the simplest things. For example, you know, Daryl, you asking me how I pronounce my name. You know, as simple as that. So yeah, that's what I'll say.
And recognizing your privilege and where you sit in the current structures, I think there's definitely a lot of conversation of the structures are broken. The structures are not broken. They are working exactly as they were designed to, and they are designed to keep people out. They are designed to push people down and to exclude. So if we just continue to move through those and try to fix them from the inside versus looking at all of the nuts and bolts of where we are in democracy and creating new systems from scratch with better intentions, not that they will still be flawed. They will still be flawed. But I think one of the things that we are breaking from right now, I think for so long, we've all moved through the systems and tried to fix them. And I think we're at this amazing point right now where people are able to step back, have taken the time over the past 18 months to look at what's been happening and are recognizing some of them are set up and are working exactly as they are intended. The exact amount of privilege is going to the exact people that it was intended to do so. So if we're able to then subvert and start new ways of doing things entirely, which again, still will be flawed, I think that we're going to be able to find better ways that include more people, and people will feel a little bit more represented. But all of that has to start at its very core, and we need people who are young and fresh and have those ideas and are not set in their ways already. I think that the older we get, the more it is this way, and we want to change but can't because we've known that and done that way for so long that we desperately need young perspectives that are not as jaded, that are just open to the new.
Yeah, either set in ways or just exhausted and not as set, but just, okay, that's the way it is. And yeah, that's a fascinating concept. I never really considered that it is, in fact, working the way it was intended, because our perception is that it was intended by and for, but that's a flawed perception, perhaps. Issues like abortion, I can't think of anything else right now, are hot topics on political tables, and they influence who people support, what things they support. Are the arts in the conversation? Is there somebody, in general, are the arts, or concerns about the arts, funding the arts, are we hearing about them, or are we just being sort of slowly, not slowly?
You know, I think that points to something I mentioned earlier, was polarization. Feels like you can't put anything out without it being categorized for you. And maybe that's, I think that is the place we're at of the dismantling. What you're a bit saying is like our structures are dismantling, and I think maybe right now in that evolution, we're at the place where dichotomy is like the only thing we can focus on, maybe, whether it is or it isn't. And I think that is a huge limitation for art right now. Huge. Yeah. But I don't think it's beyond. Like, I think that we can move past it. I think that we have to, if we don't agree with the black and whiteness of ideas and the exclusion and the segregation and things, then we need to actively choose that and show up for that inclusion in conversations and in the way we put forth art. I think maybe right now we have to be proactive about making sure those classifications aren't clamped down on our art when we put them out. This is clearly something that is tossing in my head right now. I mean, this is something I'm really thinking about. So I'm kind of speaking out loud at the moment because I'm just sort of reflecting what I feel in society at the moment.
I feel like in the visual and high arts, I think politics and arts are always coincide. I mean, artists are inspired by current events that are going around them, and it's, you know, literally manifests in the types of work that they're making. And I feel like, you know, that's a channel in terms of, you know, how do you prick an audience, or how do you introduce them to new concepts or ways of thinking or reflecting in the world through the types of art that is coming out during that, you know, time. But it's also interesting, like thinking about diversity, for example, which has become more stark of wanting to create more diverse exhibitions or including more artists of color. And this is where I say, like, implicate yourselves, because I think, like, there are a lot of good intentions that sometimes do more harm than good, for example. Like, how do we advocate but also, like, not exploit? And I think, like, this has been a very, like, thin line in the
I
arts
didn't
in
hear what you
particular.
understood. Advocate but not do what?
Exploit.
Got it, thank you.
Yeah, for example, I mean, I can give a myriad of examples, like even like in the 70s when they had feminist exhibitions. Like if you have a group of female artists that are solely exhibiting work, isn't that another form of marginalization, you know? So there was a question of, well, can men also make, you know, feminist art? Should they include men? And was it just another form of separating? And then now in the 21st century, you know, we have diverse exhibitions. So if you have, right now, there was like a mass appeal to have a lot of diversity in exhibitions last year, but I think it was amazing in terms of giving platforms and voices, but also who was it benefiting? So it's interesting, like speaking to like some of my students and how their studio practice has been kind of inspired by this, or how some of them also feel like they've been given a lot of opportunities recently, but they feel like those opportunities don't feel genuine in some sense, where they feel like they're being used to a degree, where with their studio of visits or when a curator is approaching them for a work, there seems to be a disconnect of they felt like they just wanted an object and they wanted a face to attribute to the object. And sure, they're getting these opportunities, but also who is also benefiting from these platforms that she's been given?
Absolutely.
I think a lot of it comes down to accountability within the representation, because I think right now we're at a point where, for theater arts specifically, last year there's an incredible document that came out, and then subsequent documents since, of We See You, White American Theater. Absolutely calling out the industry and reading it to filth of show up for everyone. We need representation. I think right now there is a lot of reactionary programming of, oh yes, we will. Is that just for now? I think we need the accountability so that it's not just checking those boxes, so it's not just, oh, we have the object in the face. If we actually are investing in all aspects of our society, we're wanting to have that representation at all of the levels, I think we may be in a moment of checking the boxes as institutions and organizations are figuring out how to shift from that white lens. And hopefully that continues to happen, that shift actually happens and we do find that place of true representation. But I think we are at this position of needing to hold everyone accountable for such. It's one of the things that I love-hate about grants and funding. I hate so much that we have to report of, yes, we reached this number of people in this neighborhood, and you know, this one and this one and this one and this one, we're checking all of these boxes. It can get very much formulaic and that it doesn't feel authentic. But at the same time, there are definitely organizations who are dismissing all of the boxes, and they will only present and promote and show the things that is already in their insular circle. So I think we still need the parts of the grant and funding world that I despise, because it holds everyone accountable. And when talking about how is it political, right now in our society, I don't know if the arts are that hot button. I think we are the absolute influence on the arts, influence absolutely everything. And I don't think that there's much that hasn't been influenced by some type of art in some way, whether it's street art going down the street, the music you're hearing in your neighborhood, you are influenced by art. But the large governmental fundings that happened in this past year, there was very large amounts that additional went to the museums and to the National Endowment for the Arts that somehow we didn't necessarily get talked about when everything was so politicized of, well, what about this money? How is this going there? And this funding's going there. I feel like we kind of skated by a little bit because people kind of woke up to how much they needed the arts. When everything else shut down, as we all know, what did everyone turn to? They're turning to reading and watching and listening. So I think there's some recognition that we are needed, so that I don't know if we are as political in terms of the full polarization and what is talked about on the larger scale.
Cool. Reading it to filth indeed.
Yes.
Such a term. There's one question that my department had posed. I'll post that, and then we'll close out with a general look at democracy, education, and advocacy in the arts from each of you. And he asked how these topics we've discussed might affect certain communities differently than what is perceived in the mainstream media, and any misconceptions or myths which need to be dispelled, e.g. BIPOC communities, LGBTQ plus communities, etc. Do I need to restate that?
Yes, please.
Okay. How these topics that we've been discussing might affect certain communities differently than what is perceived in the mainstream media, and any misconceptions or myths which need to be dispelled. For example, the BIPOC communities, LGBTQ plus communities, etc.
I found it really interesting that you shared the reaction from your students saying sometimes they feel tokenized or like they're put in a box in that way because they're being hired or called in or granted things. And I think that that is a reflection or an example to your question of how it doesn't exactly reflect what we're hearing in the media. Because what we get is Lin-Manuel didn't cast a diverse enough ensemble. It's like, wait, what? But, and so there are different perspectives, but it's like, well, no, did he not? Did he, and so the backlash we get sometimes from the mainstream is actually not reflective of what's happening on the ground. I think maybe there's some lag, or there's just like extra momentum happening. However, it doesn't discredit what's happening on the ground, So I think that in ways they're totally separate, and there's like one agenda that's curating this whole thing on the mainstream, and then there's like what's actually happening on the ground, and it takes all of us in between to communicate and to create allyship or advocacy with us in real life in the day-to-day.
I mean, within, the context of high art, we have artists that are making very authentic work about their experience. But then on the other hand, there's like this tremendous pressure for artists of color to feel like that their work has to be about their lived experiences in an overt sense, which I think is incredibly unfair. So if I go back to student examples, if a student feels like, they want to explore abstract expressionism, but they're told in the classroom, like, hey, like, you should like really push out like, like how you are discriminated against, or like these very like traumatic things.
Yeah.
They want it to be at the forefront of their work, but that's also what's being chosen for shows.
Right.
So if you are an artist of color that's making something that isn't, again, overtly political or inherently political, you're not going to be chosen or included in the conversation. But then at the other end, the stories that are being chosen, as authentic as they are and real, but who is that for? What's the audience? So when you go into this space and you look around at an opening, like look around you and see how diverse that crowd is, because I'm going to tell you it's not. So it's interesting for me, like even as a curator, I've had comments of, I'm an immigrant, I'm Korean, it's like, why don't you make shows about that? And it's interesting for me to think like, I can curate a show about those things that are very personal to me, but why is it that the stories that I may tell in regards to that would be very specific to an audience that feels comfortable in that space, where my own family wouldn't be comfortable to go see this exhibition that is actually about them?
Sure.
So it's something to always consider.
Because it's too easy to tell an artist they're that one thing. I think that's such an easy way for people to identify, but it absolutely tokenizes each individual that you are that. And it needs to be that you are BIPOC first, you're LGBTQ first, I'm a woman first, I am, but there's more to it than all of those pieces. And there is a push for, we need to see all stories, but does it need to be all trauma-based? Does it need to be all, the stories that this society thinks that we have to have? What about just the family? Why can we not just have a family drama that happens to be representative of all of the other populations? We so often relegate the stories to being about the issues. And why are they issues? Because we continue to make them the center of everything. So.
I love what you said about just bringing up trauma. Like, do we have to keep bringing up and cutting the old wounds? The artist should be clear if they want to do that or if they don't want to do that. And I think that that's where the real advocacy work comes in on part of the artist, to say, a person that is awarding this grant or whatever, you know, this is what my work stands for right now, and, you know, will you accept that? If not, I'll move on to somebody else who's willing to invest in me or something. But it's only until we hold our space that the environment around us changes.
Okay, we've dissected, thank you. We've dissected each individual word, and just one sort of final words on the combination of democracy, education, and advocacy in the arts, specifically pointed toward what our students can be planting a seed in their head, their brains, and their hearts, their feet, their hands, their pocketbooks, as to what they can be moving forward. But while they're thinking about that, last call for questions or comments? Last call. Okay, yes.
I would say at the end of the day, I think these are three things we can't really avoid. I think you can try to skirt advocacy, but I don't think you can fully avoid it. I think we're all, whether we like it or not, we are members of society. We are all walking through our lives day to day, influenced by so many other people and the things around us. I don't think that we can avoid learning or unlearning something, part of the education. We are a part of this democracy. We are a member of this society. We can't avoid that part of it. As much as sometimes we may want to reject it, and we may want to hide in our corners, we can't. And then you have to self-advocate for so many things, whether it's you're merging on the highway and the truck will not let you forward. You have to drive up or go back. You have to choose to take care of yourself and push forward, or allow that person, which then you are advocating for them, to move ahead. So I think all three are so congruent in that it's life. And as an artist, we have the opportunity to look upon those things and reflect and show them through what we do. It's a little bit different than doing, we do math, right? How are you putting in society and the influences of everything around you into, I don't know, I don't math. So, but how would you do that versus in the arts? We're expressing all of our influences. We're expressing how we feel and all of the things around us, whether we recognize it or not. So I don't know if the three can be separated. I think, for young people coming into the world, self-reflection is huge. Knowing who you are and knowing that it will change, and knowing that it is okay to not know everything. None of us do, right? So know that you will fail. It does not make you a failure. Know that you will succeed, and you need to learn from those successes as well. So I just don't know if there's a way as an artist to move through life without the three mixing and meddling with us.
I will say that for our students, art is inherently political, whether you think your work isn't or isn't. So don't underestimate your work and what it says or what it doesn't say. And also, like, you're a student, what a privilege to have an education. In this safe space, this is a place where you can experiment with the most radical ideas. This is a place where you have a cohort. This is where you have discourse. This is where you have discussions and friction and antagonism. So, like, explore those things and don't be too passive. Like, it's okay. This is a safe space to make mistakes.
Yeah, I loved this space. This is a great space. The two words which I've mentioned earlier are authenticity and curiosity. Right now in this age, you're coming into the best version of yourself, and I think we all still are. Like, it's a lifelong journey. But these are such, like, wonderful years to do those extremes, to be bold, and to really feel where it is your curiosity is taking you. You'll still bounce around, when you get out of school. But curiosity and authenticity will continue to ground you. I think that's really important in this time as well. To not be taken for a ride in so many different ways. But the more you can be in touch with, like, what moves you and what is so special and valuable about your voice and about the work you choose to create is the best offering that you can give to the community and the world around you and your family. Even if you will move through fear within all of these things, and breaking down boundaries, but it's all part of it. And on the other side is wonderful, keep moving through those.
Excellent. Amen, amen, amen. So be it, Ashe, and thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I believe that's
That's it?
Cool.
It's probably still running.
Thank
If
you,
it is,
Daryl.
sorry about that.